All right, guys, so we're installing the torque locker in a 2021 Talon X. First thing you do is remove your bumper, then your winch with the winch plate, then take the tires off. Now, I've never done one of these, so I'm making it up as I go. It looks like there's plenty of room to slide the differential forward through the front of there, so that's my plan. I like that. It comes out like the rear diff does. And then also looking at it, obviously I got to get the axles out. And I don't like separating these bottom ball joints because they're a pain in the ass on Super ATVs. So I'm just going to take off the bottom control arm and so I can pop the axle out enough to get it out of the way like that, and then just let it all hang, the axle and the bottom control arm, while I do the diff. That won't mess with my portals too much, and I can leave most of it intact and bust as few ball joints as possible because these Super ATV ball joints are a giant pain in the butt. Now, the other hard thing on here is going to be disconnecting it from the front drive shaft. There's a little clip you got to get out, and it's way up in there. You can see it kind of going to be way back there near the U-joint. Now, all right, so the plan's working so far. Talon's got these really big seals for the axle and the diff, and that's because it's got these crazy rings on the axles for the 8-track i4-wheel drive system, speed sensors. So that's kind of a pain in the butt because those seals are going to be really easy to damage. I didn't buy new ones, so keep an eye on that. My fluid and differential is very clean. Very nice. It was great because I've only changed it once and that was it breaking. But now I can pretty much slide the differential forward. I got the axles out, so everything's just hanging right now. Pain in the butt because those things are so heavy. So to put them back in, you might need one person to lift them and another person to actually stab it, just because of how heavy the portal box is. So if you are, down to one person, it might be a better idea to actually remove the portal. But I'm gonna do as little work as possible and mess with the ball joints as little as possible because Super ATV ball joints suck. So I'm actually gonna put the shock bolts back in so that it's hanging on the shock and not the ball joint. But other than that, I'm ready to pull the diff forward. All right, admittedly, this was a little bit more of a pain in the ass than I thought it was gonna be. So I ended up taking it apart the way Honda wants you to, which is to remove that little snap ring. You see those two little things right there? You have to take those, spread them open, and then that'll slide out of the back of the diff. Now, as you can see, mine's pretty rusty and full of mud, so I'm glad I did that anyways. Now I can grease that and service it. But what that tells you is that that's what it fought me so much, is because it was really full of mud and it was stuck in there. Which means that's not sealed very good, or Honda's not putting enough grease on it from the factory. But this little springy thing right here that I'm touching, you have to spread this open, and then you can get the drive shaft to snap out of the back of the diff. It is a pain in the butt. I had to make a special tool for it. So you grind down the back of the pliers right there and there. So go like that, spread it open. The snap ring pliers didn't quite do the trick. Then after you get that loose, you realize that the diff just barely fits. See where those scratches are? Just barely fits between here, where that cup's sitting right now, and up here. Now, it's tight, but I was able to do it with just a pry bar. Didn't actually need the hammer. And it will slide forward intact like this, and it'll clear the steering rack. It's tight though. I mean, it is extremely tight because there's barely enough room between this and that up there for it to come up and out. It's got to come up like this. So you really got to give it some force and get it jiggled in there just right. You can see where it was rubbing here. You can see down there where it's sitting there. So it's a tight fit. It's kind of a pain in the ass. Doesn't feel super Honda. Honda usually makes things a little bit easier than that, but it's ready to come out now. That was by far the hardest part, is getting the drive shaft out. Now I've got to clean all that really well, obviously, and grease it before it goes back together. And I'm sure you find that together too. To get all these sensors and stuff off, I decided to leave most of the sensors on the diff, as you can see. There's a sensor up there, sensor here. You could take them off. I'm going to see if I have any run-into issues with them on there like that. And then I unbolted the plate and pulled all of the wires off the back. So there's a lot of sensors on this diff. There's a 4-wheel drive sensor, there's a speed sensor there, there's 3 speed sensors up here. A lot of sensors, see all the wires. It's also made more complicated looking by my 4x4 override, which I think is required for the locker, in my opinion. Because, now that I'm putting this locker in here, I don't even need all of these speed sensors. They're all kind of pointless now that there's a locker. The reason it's all complicated is to give you that 8-track. So now I'm going to yank the diff out of here and throw it on the bench. Always remember to drain your oil before you do this, so you don't end up with a mess like I did. I forgot to do that. But this is a pretty serious job. I would not recommend doing this unless you think you're pretty capable. Also, fun fact, there's a slot in the shaft, you see right there. See how the piece is cut out on the diff side? You have to line that up with this window right here so you can get in there and spread that open, which means you should probably have your back tires jacked up so you could spin it. I lucked out and it was close enough where I could just rock it and get it lined up enough. But that is what gives you the ability to spread open that spring I was showing you a second ago. So pro tip, don't do it the way I'm doing it. Get the whole thing off the ground. Obviously use some jack stands if you value your life, and do it that way. By the way, the torque locker install instructions don't tell you anything about getting the differential out of the bike. You're on your own for that. I tried to do it away with pulling the whole front drive shaft. That didn't work out. The drive shaft was really stuck on the back shaft, so I ended up separating it, right here, like I showed you. So digging into why this is so crummy looking, like there's obviously been water getting in here the whole time, right? And it's damaging these splines, of course. There are 2 O-rings right here, 1, 2, and they must just be too small to really seal properly because they're letting shit pass it. So I'm gonna replace those O-rings with a fatter O-ring to try to fix that. And you can see the issue with the drive shaft, that U-joint back there won't fit through this tunnel, so you have to remove that, and that's a huge pain in the butt to get to those bolts, so I didn't want to mess with that. That's why I ended up leaving the drive shaft in here. The drive shaft's almost straight. I really wish Honda could have found a way to do it without U-joints, but whatever. Because some people have had issues reportedly with this front U-joint, and I do have some vibration in mine. My U-joint feels fine, but I don't love this setup, you know what I mean? Very annoying. So I'm gonna clean that up real good and then put some fatter O-rings there. All right, so I've opened up the differential. Everything in here is very straightforward so far. Obviously pay attention to which side that shim came off of. That's what sets your ring gear and pinion gear backlash. And then you just tap it apart. I tapped right here to separate it. You can see where I hit it with the hammer a little bit. Just tap it apart. It's just held together with Ultra Gray, so it's a little bit of tight fit. This diff is really big and beefy, which is great. We like beefy. These bolts, obviously you need to keep them clean and oil free and lock tight the shit out of them or tack weld them back in. That's what I've done in the past. But yeah, overall it's just like any other torque locker install in a Honda. So pull all these bolts out. These are big 14 bolts, which is nice. Sometimes they're 12s. Usually they're 12s. I've never seen a diff quite this beefy. I'm sure the P1000 looks the same. Never actually opened up one of those. And it's basically, they give you good instructions for this part, so you really don't need my help. Read the instructions in the kit. But that's all the shit you're going to throw away, is all those cam and cam followers. So I'm just going to figure out where that one went. Make a big pile of them right here. They're stuck in there. But anyways, you're replacing those 2 side gears and all the cam and cam followers with a locker assembly. You can see there's hardly any wear in here. This is Honda's crazy differential that uses cam and cam followers. That bottom piece being the cam, these being the followers, and it gives you like a weird type of differential with a little bit limited slip, and it works pretty good with the i4-wheel drive on stock tires. Obviously on big tires it doesn't do anything. That's why we're replacing it with the torque locker. And in the torque locker, which you have over here, they give you a new big thrust washer, and that's the only washer you use inside the carrier. This part is actually the easiest part. So you remove all the innards of the carrier, including these 2 washers, the regular washer and this thrust washer. You do not reuse any of that. So you take this big thrust washer that came with your locker, you throw it in there like so. And then it's just a matter of dropping everything in with the springs. They say to do it, install it into this side of it, the deep side, and then flip it into there. It seems a little silly to me. I'm gonna install it this way because I want this side of the diff staying down the whole time. So some in the locker, you take each piece and you put a little bit of medium grease, whatever medium grease means. I'm using some medium, I guess, RCV CV grease, because this works kind of like a CV. It's a little ratchet, right? So you put that on each tooth. That's what the instruction says. That's what we're gonna do. So a little bit on each tooth, smear that around. And we've already got the flush washer in there that came with the locker. Drop that on there. And then you gotta put the next piece, which is right here. So that's the axle piece. This is the other one. So again, a little bit of grease on each tooth. This just helps it not get damaged during initial break-in for gear oils got slung everywhere. You don't have to run any special additives with this locker or anything like that. Okay, smear that around, and then push that down. And then we put our 2 springs. The instructions do say to install this in the other half of the carrier, but this is how I've done most of mine. I think it works just fine, as long as you can figure it out. Okay, so then you have to put this piece on. This is the piece that will be locking into it. Now you can see that that is different on both sides, right? So we got to make sure we put this in the right way. These pieces are the same on both sides, so they don't really matter. When you have it in this piece, this should be facing up, flush with it, like that. So we know that this needs to go down this way, all right? Because it's just the opposite thing. So that pin is what actually transmits the force and what makes the gear lock in, right? As pressure gets put on it, it pushes on the ratchets and engages it. So now we got to put in this next piece. Springs are leaning a little bit. Oop, lost a spring. Which will make it tricky. So I'm going to put a little bit of grease to hold the springs where I want them. So I don't have to deal with that issue. It's always a nice trick to use grease to hold things, temporarily during install. Okay, so now my springs are sticking straight up and down, which will make it easier to line all this up. So we're going to put these two pieces, fit down in those grooves like that, pretty simply. Boom. And that spring is what keeps a little bit of pressure on these ratchets, but not so much that they can't disengage. My experience with this locker on the street, because I've ran the Aussie lockers in trucks and stuff, is they work pretty good in trucks, but when you put them in the front diff, pretty much whenever you're in four-wheel drive, it's locked. So the whole reason you're doing this is so when you're in two-wheel drive, you have no differential really, not even open, and when you're in four-wheel drive, you have a locker. What we're going for here is the locker, because Honda neglected to give us what we needed. Okay, so that's all in there, right? Okay, now see this has some wiggle room, and this pin can slide around a little bit. So you got to get the pin centered, so you can get these fingers, which used to hold the cam followers, to go around that. Okay. Boom. Doesn't get much easier than that. Now you've got to clean your holes and apply a bunch of red Loctite and re-torque. Some of these are keyed, right? They go in a certain way. This one doesn't seem to be the case. All the holes are lining up fine. And when you go to this locker, it doesn't really matter. With the stock locker, with all these little cam and cam followers, there's almost like a timing aspect to it. It's very important to have all of these in the right direction, all this. None of that matters, right, with this type of locker. So all you got to do now is put a bunch of Loctite and tighten the shit out of these. I'm actually going to fire up the welder and tack weld each bolt to the carrier because I do not want them backing out, and I've had that happen way too many times. But pretty simple install. Like I said, once you get the thing out of the bike, obviously remember to put your thrust washer back on here, and then ultra-grade the case back together and throw it back together, and you're good to go. All right, so there it is. Every bolt welded in place. Nice little tacks. All right, it's all cleaned up. So now I have peace of mind that none of those are ever going to back out. The reason I'm paranoid about this is because I had several 300 differentials explode back in the day running the first Highlifter gearless locker. A gearless locker, this is also kind of gearless, but those are kind of like gears. Anyways, when you go to a ratcheting type locker, it changes the harmonics in the front diff, and that can cause problems for you. So by going in and wiring or tack welding every bolt in, you don't have to worry about those suckers loosening up, and it's some extra peace of mind. And this job is way too hard to be doing twice and replacing cases. If these bolts back out, obviously it destroys the diff. So I recommend welding them in. Now I just got to ultra-grade it together. This side's already clean. I clean up this side and throw it back in the machine. The very important steps of testing this locker is to see if it freewheels. So this is two-wheel drive, so you're not spinning the drive shaft, right? CV joint's spinning, drive shaft is not spinning, all right? And you hear that ratcheting action, that's what you want to hear. So this tire can freewheel, right? That ratcheting will get quieter once the gear oil gets slung around and everything. But this tire can freewheel, both directions ratcheting, and you check this side, both directions ratcheting. It's exactly what you want to hear. Okay, now we're gonna lock it in with our 4x4 override. Should be locked in. Now we should have locker action. Boom. Lock solid. Yes, there is some backlash. This system does add backlash to your drivetrain. But as soon as that pinion gear is locked into the drive shaft and there's some input the other way, you're locked. So now, unlike the Pioneer 1000, which has two-wheel drive, four-wheel drive, and four-wheel drive diff lock, this thing basically has two-wheel drive and four-wheel drive diff lock, which, when you're configured as such, that's what you want. You're gonna have to really keep both hands on the steering wheel on this sucker in four-wheel drive now. Power steering is gonna hate it. Just playing with all the suspension, you really start to realize how much force and weight these portals add. Just to pick up the portal and the arm way up here to get the axle and the diff, it's about impossible by yourself. And like, I'm not the strongest person in the world, but it's still like, that's a lot of weight to have, you know, kind of in one arm while you're trying to have the other hand to stab the axle and not mess up that seal. It's doable, but it's tricky. I mean, you add a ton of unsprung weight with the portals, but that's all good. So now I got to go through, torque down all the bolts one more extra time. Portals had a lot of force, so I really torque all these down. I got to reinstall my winch, reinstall the front bumper, put a few of these plastic guards back on. I took those off, you know, to access the drive shaft. While we're down here, let's make sure that that thing is fully seated. It is. So that's how the drive shaft should look once you get all back together. It went back together easier than it came apart, thank goodness. That little snap ring was a pain in the ass coming apart. That was the hardest part of the job. But everything looks pretty good. So we got all the connectors in there. Hopefully this won't throw any lights. It shouldn't, because you know, now we're gonna have even less relative motion between the front axles when you're locked, because it's a locker now, which is the whole point of a locker, is to make sure both the axles spin at the same rate. So pretty easy install. The only thing is that my portals made it some extra work. Getting that back clip made it some extra work, and I went in and welded the bolts, so that was some extra work, but still, I did the whole job in about 3.5 hours. First time ever pulling the front diff out of a Talon. I could probably do it in 3 hours next time. So not a terrible job, but I wouldn't recommend doing it unless you got some pretty good experience, because that back drive shaft could fight you for a few days if you don't know what you're doing. PB Blaster was key. I soaked that clip in PB Blaster. First thing I did when I started working on it, so by the time I got to it, it had been sitting for about 30 minutes. That made it possible.
This tire's not touching.